Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Cryptids and Monsters video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's continue Chapter 3, Part 2 of the Occult Investigator, Real Cases from the Files of Ex-Investigations book by Bob Johnson. Chapter 3 again being titled The Transylvanian Curse. Last we left off when it came to Part 1, that was when the group was going to be heading off to Transylvania. Interesting stuff. A place definitely that I'd love to check out one of these days on my bucket list. Love to hear if anyone else has already done so before. And this will wrap up this chapter, and then I'll give my own thoughts and opinions on it after. But otherwise, a pretty good chapter so far when it comes to one young man's apparent quest for power, and then the fact that this led to a difficult, very almost dangerous, almost deadly situation, not just for him, but also for his family. So again, let's continue part 2 of chapter 3, and here's what it states. I couldn't let on to my tour group that I had a dual purpose for visiting Transylvania. Most of the other 25 or so members were garden variety horror fans or looking for a different kick. Truth is, they probably wouldn't have believed me anyway if I told them that I was on a mission to find a Romanian who could reverse a curse. And since I had originally planned the trip to be a pleasure jaunt, faking it wouldn't be that difficult. What was difficult was recalling the look in Charles's eyes. It creeped me out just thinking about it. I knew that unless I got past it, the feeling would haunt me on the entire flight across the Atlantic. What's more, I didn't have Silvana, my partner and comrade, to aid me on this trip. She had left just days before my call from Brad to participate in a special symposium at the Rhine Research Center for the Paranormal at Duke University. It was also unfortunate for me because Silvana could have communicated more easily with the East European locals, and she has a knack for sensing trouble and ability to save our hides more times than I can recall. After arriving in Bucharest, I asked Danny, our tour guide, if he could arrange a local guide to help me find some of my relatives in the town of Sighisoara. He looked at me strangely and asked if I knew that that town was the alleged birthplace of Vlad the Impaler, better known as Dracula. I nodded and quickly said, "Oh sure, that's what makes this trip so exciting for me, because I'll have a chance to ask my relations whether this legend is true." Danny found me a personal guide, a wiry, swarthy fellow named Stosh, who wore a New York Mets baseball cap and spoke a style of English that left out most conjunctions. Dracula born here, I take, were Stosh's first words to me. It took the better part of an hour to explain that I needed to visit Ilana Kastanavosh, the Sighisoara's gypsy aunt. I learned that Ilana lived far on the outskirts of Sighisoara, some 15 miles away. Stosh said that we would take his car only so far because that road ended. I wasn't prepared for the last leg of a journey to Ilana's house, which required us to hitchhike on a local peasant's horse-drawn wagon through the woods and finally through a local cemetery, which was the only passable routes. This journey was becoming more and more bizarre, and it may have been my mind playing tricks on me, but the closer we got to Ilana's home, the more intense were my memories of Charlie's eyes as we performed that ritual back in New York. Now, the ride to Ilana's was straight out of Bram Stoker's Dracula. The road, if you could call it that, was coarse, dirty, and filled with small ravines and ditches that made New York City's Brooklyn and Queens Expressway seemed like the Autobahn. I was awed at how perfect Hollywood had been in recreating the Transylvanian woods, just as I remembered it from countless horror movies. Winding passages topped in ground fog and illuminated by the pale yellow moon that dipped in and out from behind twisted trees that blocked the light. And it was cold. I turned up my collar to brace against that biting, damp cold that goes right through you. We had been riding in the wagon for about a half hour longer than I had anticipated. Just as I was about to ask Stosh where the hell we were, the driver said something to Stosh in a local Romanian dialect that I could tell meant we were at our destination and he wanted some money. I gave Stosh some cash, and as he paid the wagon driver, he pointed to Ilana's house, which was barely visible about 100 yards away. As we walked over the dirt, I kept asking myself why I had taken on this assignment. Being in the land of monsters was surreal enough, but dealing with the supernatural in Spook Central started to unnerve even me. I wish that Savannah was with me to offer her usual moral support, but more important, for her experience. She would have been able to sense any danger that lay ahead. Although I had none of Savannah's cognitive psychic abilities, I did feel uneasy. There was an aura of something ancient and heavy in the wooded area outside of Alana's house, and the makeshift graveyard with scattered headstones and wooden crosses that lined the path only added to my suspicions. I couldn't have created a more perfect movie set in my mind. The only thing missing was that creature jumping out of the woods. But as we reached Alana's front door and knocked, I discovered something even more frightening. A young man entered the door. At first, I wasn't sure if I was experiencing some wicked déjà vu or if I was tired from my exhausting trip. But when the boy who answered the door came closer into the light of the moon, I stepped back and stared at his face. This was Charles, or rather Charles's twin. This young man was the exact duplicate of the boy in New York whose parents had feared he was cursed. This freaky coincidence instantly renewed my interest in the case and started me to think that there may actually have been more of a link to the blood oath than even Petrov understood. So my mind raced as Stosh explained to the boy who we were and why we were at his front door. Maybe this boy was somehow physically linked to Charles. So was he cursed as well? Was he really a vampire? Once Ilana was convinced that I was in fact an emissary from her relative in the States, she introduced me to her son, Stephen, who appeared to be a normal teenager who was typically curious but too cool to show any exuberance over my arrival. I thought that the Yankees yearbook that I happened to have in my briefcase might be a good icebreaker. I had noticed that the wagon driver wore a Mets cap, as did Stosh, so I figured an American baseball item might be a good way to win over Steven. But this boy was much more interested in my occult experiences than baseball. He asked his mother in Romanian if I had ever witnessed the living dead. As he uttered the words, Ilana made the sign of the cross 3 times and admonished Stephen for his blasphemy. He simply smiled and looked my way with the same disturbing eyes as Charles's. Stephen then burst into a fit of anger when Ilana admonished him. He yelled and drew things around the small house. The intensity and suddenness of Stephen's violent outbursts was startling. The teenager had become a raving beast. As cliched as it sounded, the only way to describe Stephen's behavior was that of a man possessed. He stomped out of the kitchen where we had all met and slammed the door to his small room in the back of the house, still screaming in Romanian at the top of his lungs. Ilana begged us to leave, but I explained that I had come a long way and had a job to do for her relative. Stosh translated what Ilana said next. Stephen is troubled by things we as mortals cannot explain. She went on to say that if the boy in the United States had similar problems, I was in great danger if I continued my investigation. I wasn't about to turn tail and run for a number of reasons, the least of which was that now my curiosity had been raised 1,000-fold. It was no longer a mission for the Stegosaurus alone. The adventure now had the makings of a very intriguing paranormal or occult case for me. That the 2 boys were nearly the same age and seemingly exact duplicates added an eerie dimension to the curse theory. It was becoming clear to me that Charles and Stephen were linked by an ancient and malevolent bond. I was determined to find out how that link had been forged. I begged Ilana to calm down and said that I would leave now if I could return again to speak with her and Stephen. Stosh translated for her that we would meet at a local tourist attraction where the caretaker was an expert on folk tales and matters of the occult. Of course I agreed, though I was both stunned and amused that the meeting was to take place in the Carpathian Mountains and not under than the Castle Dracula Hotel. And so it was snowing lightly the following day when I arrived at the hotel. Aside from the signage, the castle looked like any normal mid-range European hotel standing against a bleak gray sky. It was a typically older building with small rooms and a tidy lobby and was very cold. The lobby area did have a small showcase hawking Transylvanian wine, but the hotel was out of stock. The kitschness of the surroundings was somewhat comforting as I thought about the seriousness of Charles's problem. Could he really be suffering from a vampire curse, I wondered? I sighed Aside from the outbursts and the clues Alana had mentioned to me, I hadn't yet witnessed anything paranormal or unexplainable. I took that comfort with me as I checked into my room for a one-night stay. I was to meet with Alana and her local expert that evening for dinner. It was around 4:30 p.m., so I thought I'd make good use of the time by consulting some of the books I had brought along that describe various Romanian curse legends, particularly vampire myths and blood rituals. What rang clear through all of my reading was the link between young men and bloodletting, especially concerning soldiers and warriors. To drink the blood of an enemy was the ultimate victory and the key to everlasting life. These warrior myths, later mixed with the Christian rituals of symbolically drinking the blood of Christ, had powerful psychological influences on young men in the region that in my mind could have created some bizarre psychic links between blood relations. I theorized that either Stephen or Charles, whomever began the blood frenzy, was the main catalyst in the curse. Ilana arrived at 7 p.m. with her friend Christopher. We enjoyed a dinner consisting primarily of mixed meats and cabbage in the castle's modest dining room, and then proceeded outside to be entertained by local dancers around a huge bonfire. The dance's origin was obviously rooted in hedonistic pagan beliefs. The elaborately costumed dancers dipped and swirled around the fire in a frenzied state, and at times they would actually leap into the flames. As we watched, transfixed by their gyrations, our gaze was interrupted by the band leader who handed out raw meat to be skewered and cooked over the fire. I learned that it was local custom to cook the meat over the fire and eat in celebration of simply being alive. I also heard whispers among the crowd that the meat was really to fatten us up and to make our blood rich for the Nosferatu. I was eager to get out of the cold, and as we walked back to the castle, I took Christopher by the arm. As we walked, I made sure we were out of Alana's earshot so I could bluntly ask him if he knew anything about vampire curses, especially involving links between family members. He nodded and said that despite modern disbelief, curses do exist. He explained that whether they are simply psychological manifestations brought on by something as far as dysfunction or are of a paranormal origin, he had seen hundreds of instances of unexplained and sometimes terrifying occurrences. My friend, to you this may seem startling, but to my people it is as common as any religious belief. Alana told me of her son's problem and how you are investigating for the American cousins. I will tell you the signs are all apparent. The boys are linked in their minds and there is a curse. There are vampires in their minds and the blood of the curse flows within them. It doesn't matter whether you believe that it is merely a neurosis or a supernatural phenomenon. No matter, there are certain rituals that must be performed to eliminate the curse. It is the only way the Stegosaurus will have peace, Christopher said. I had to take a breath. I expected some insight, but I never expected to hear my Romanian consultant nail the problem so matter-of-factly from the get-go. And so we spoke for 4 hours that evening. Alana and I learned that Charles and Stephen, because of their age and blood relation, were connected across the ocean in some telepathic conduit. One of the boys harbored the curse in his subconscious mind and was affecting his relative. Christian explained that regardless of the fact that the families had never physically met, the deep belief in the parents' mind and the recounting of the tales and stories associated with the curse had been deeply rooted in one of the boys' mind. After his entering manhood, the curse had taken hold. It doesn't matter what we believe is possible. We simply do not understand how the mind, or the soul for that matter, really works. What matters is that the boys believe they are vampires and they will act accordingly, Christopher told me. Somehow, I reasoned, both families had planted the cursed seed in their boys' mind, and in one of those minds, the legend took hold. I could not explain how the minds connected across the Atlantic Ocean, other than by mere coincidence or perhaps some psychic connections that we have not yet discovered. But when we returned to Alana's home and saw Stephen sitting at the kitchen table in front of a gutted rabbit, its entrails in his hands and his mouth and face drenched in blood, I knew that I had to contact the Stegosaurus to see if Charles had gone this far as well. If he had, we needed to act immediately. The Stegosaurus were glad to hear from me. Before I could utter a word, Alana blurted out that Charles had done something terrible. Calm down, I said to her. Did it have to do with an animal? Yes. Charles was eating a freshly killed chicken in his room. It was horrible. There was blood everywhere. We think he is very ill, Anna said hysterically. I said that I was close to solving the problem in Romania and that hopefully Charles would be okay. I told her that Charles should see a doctor and a mental health professional in the interim, and she agreed. The truth was that Christopher had only mentioned that there was a possible solution, but we'd need to have Stephen's cooperation. What was required was that we conduct a psychodrama ritual that could convince Stephen that he was no longer cursed. The problem, according to Christopher, was that Stephen and Charles had to be willing to have the curse removed. It is very appealing and sexy to be a vampire nowadays, or at least to think you are one, and so these boys may resist, Christopher said. We were sure we would have a hard time convincing Stephen to participate in the ritual. We'd even come up with a ruse that we thought would persuade him that he was performing an ancient rite of passage. But when we approached him, he had said that he knew exactly what we were up to and that he'd gladly participate because it could only strengthen his abilities and insight into the living death. You may do as you please. I will gain strength from your attempts, and my eyes will be completely open to the immortality, Stephen said to us in his native tongue. His mother, distressed and crying, pleaded that we help her. Please expel this evil from my son, she said, and I couldn't help but think that this line sounded like it came from a late-night TV movie script, but I was there, and it was real. And so Christopher and I entered an abandoned mausoleum on what he described as sacred ground about a quarter mile from Alana's home. He said that the banishing ritual must be performed on consecrated earth, primarily for the psychological influence it would have, and partly because Christopher believed that it was essential to direct the powers, whatever they might be, to do our bidding and relive the curse. And so we had to prepare dozens of bags of rare herbs, including mugwort and mandrake root for incense burning, as well as pouring vials of absinthe, a potent drink used as a hallucinogen for hundreds of years. Christopher explained that Stephen would have to release the curse from his subconscious and that the mind-altering substances could help. He also explained that the true catalyst that would break the curse was fear. We must remove the evil seduction by showing Stephen the horrors of the living death. I was prepared to conduct the unusual ritual until Christopher explained how we would expose the evil. I shook my head in disbelief when he said, "We must now prepare the corpse." Christopher's aim was clearly to scare the hell out of Stephen by exposing him to a real dead body. Fortunately or unfortunately for my sanity, the local Romanian laws governing the funeral business are much more lax than in the United States, so Christopher was able to procure a body through a close friend in the cemetery business. Christopher was serious about this ritual, and he explained that although some theatrics were necessary, strange and unexplainable things often happened during the ceremonies. And so Alana, Stephen, and I took the short walk into the cemetery close to midnight the next day. Stephen was cocky and seemed eager to begin the ritual. His mother translated Stephen's comments that spoke of how this was his destiny and how he and his blood relations around the world would live forever and partake of the pleasures of the night. If it wasn't for the despair on Alana's face, I would have laughed at Stephen's vampire comic book dialogue, but the boy was serious. As we got closer to the mausoleum door, he became anxious and agitated, ripping his shirt open to expose his chest to the cold night air. We entered a candlelit stone room heavy with the smell of burning incense. Christopher stood at the far end. Only his face was visible from our vantage point, but I could make out a large wooden box on the ground before him. On top of the box was visible was a bottle of green absinthe elixir and a large open book bound in torn leather that looked centuries old. Christopher wasted no time and asked Stephen in their native language if he was prepared to open his mind to the unknown and make the passage into manhood. Stephen walked directly towards Christopher, placed both of his palms on the box, and said, "I am a true vampire. Do what you will to me." And so Stephen obeyed Christopher's instruction to drink the vial of absinthe. The mixed odors of the incense permeated the room, and I felt myself becoming a bit lightheaded. I knew it wouldn't be long until Stephen was swooning from the mixture of incense and absinthe. He began to sweat profusely as Christopher recited from the book. And then for about 15 minutes, Christopher conducted staccato questions and answers that I gathered were meant to challenge Stephen's belief in and allegiance to the supernatural. At first, Stephen was cocksure and arrogant, but as the smoke and absinthe kicked in, he began to sway and slur his speech. Almost 30 minutes into the ritual, Christopher pushed Stephen back from the box, removed his lid, and exposed the corpse. Alana gasped, but her son could do nothing but stand transfixed by the dead body below him. He could barely keep his footing as he turned repeatedly to look at his mother, while Christopher's recitations became louder and faster. I learned later what Christopher was shouting repeatedly at the boy. Do you relinquish your mortal soul to the immortal? Do you forsake all good for evil? Do you lust for the taste of blood? Do you seek the stench of death? And so Christopher pounded these words at Stephen time after time, finally standing directly in his face, spittle flying from his mouth and splashing the young boy's eyes. He grabbed Stephen by the shoulders and pushed his face into the box only inches from the face of the corpse. If you are to live as the dead, now live with the dead. Christopher screamed as he pushed Stephen into the box with the body. Stephen stumbled comically into the box, landing face down, face to face with the corpse. Alana screamed at Christopher that this was enough and to get her son out of the box, but Christopher held her arms against her chest and said it was necessary to break the curse. In all of the commotion, I wasn't sure myself that this was simply a scare tactic or if we were actually conjuring malevolent forces. The air in the crypt became dank and smelled of rotting flesh. The candles flickered wildly and we all began to sweat profusely. But Christopher showed the boy no mercy and asked for my assistance to hold him down into the box. Don't let him up, he shouted at me, until he tastes death. And so the melee lasted nearly 15 minutes, but it seemed as if we held the boy's body next to the corpse for more than an hour. Stephen finally spoke in a soft, calm voice, saying that he had had enough and had witnessed true evil. Christopher translated his words. Mother, I now know that mortal death is not to be feared. The living death is the soul's only torment. During our journey back to the hotel, I couldn't help but think that I had just witnessed an incredibly bizarre combination of psychodrama, homegrown psychotherapy, folk mythology, and scared straight tactics. What was amazing was that it appeared to have worked and dispelled the vampire blood curse that had seduced Stevens' young mind. My sense of accomplishment was short-lived when I remembered that this was only half the battle. I might have to perform the same ritual on the Stegosaurus' son Charles back in Connecticut. When I arrived at the hotel, the desk manager handed me a phone message. It was from the Stegosaurus. It said, Mr. Johnson, we are happy to tell you that Charles miraculously has changed his attitude and habit within the last few hours. It went on to explain that the boy wept to his parents that he was wrong and sorry for his recent actions and that he loved them and life very much. I was happy to hear the good news, but I was stunned when I read the time and message was delivered. 2 a.m. Transylvania time, the exact time Stephen broke down during our ceremony ritual. The curse was broken not only in Romania, but in a boy's bedroom halfway around the world. And then that's it. That ends Chapter 3, The Transylvanian Curse, from the book Occult Investigator, Real Cases from the Files of X Investigations by Bob Johnson. So let's go ahead and let's briefly talk about that here. First off, what an interesting twist, right, when it came to his trip, Bob Johnson's trip over to Transylvania. There he went trying to take care of things, trying to find out what was happening to the Stegosaurus' son, Charles. And then that way, when he arrived in Transylvania, lo and behold, he met the opposite, or should I say rather the twin associated with Charles. In this case, another young boy named Stephen. So it was from opposite directions, halfway around the world as the chapter ended. And yet here you had almost like an identical twin experiencing the same exact thing, one for each other, but different parts of the world. Both of them essentially thinking they were involved in some curse, and by blood link or some other type of weird psychoanalytic thing. Who knows? They were experiencing the very same type of power hunger. Like, in other words, they both wanted to be vampires. They were both doing bad things in order to get there. And then it seemed like when one person was doing something, the other person was also experiencing it at the very exact same time. I'm scratching my head how that could be, right, when it comes to something like this. But according to Bob Johnson, that's essentially what was happening. This ritual followed by the bonding of blood, and who knows how many centuries it was, even though they were across the world, as far as the Sigosauruses now having their family there in America, it still continued strong. It made me wonder, too, if they had stayed overseas, in this case, either in Transylvania or somewhere else, if that bond would have been even stronger. And who knows? And the impression I got, too, was that it was actually Stephen over here in Transylvania was the one that started it. So in other words, he started his course for power, for immortality, as they called it, the living dead. And then that in turn caused the other boy, in that case Stephen, in the U.S. to follow as well. Fascinating stuff. Never ever heard something along those lines. I don't know if they were exactly just twins. They're probably not, obviously, because they were at least born from different mothers and fathers, but still they had that connection when it came to that. And then it took, if you wanted even more evidence of that connection, it took the side on Stevens's ritual, and then as far as that almost exorcism, to get whatever it was out of him, to get that living death dream out of him, that caused in turn the other boy, Charles, to also be cured of it. So fascinating stuff. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are with regards to this chapter as well. So please post those comments below. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.